Thank you. Welcome. My name is Joe Seidel, and I head up the Washington office for Credit Suisse and Public Policy Americas for Credit Suisse. We're thrilled to have you join us today for our session on U.S. politics and policy, the path of the U.S., and in particular how it affects Asia. We are absolutely thrilled to have two very experienced Washington, what I would call probably insiders and outsiders both, people who have long careers in Washington and are extremely insightful in terms of the U.S. political situation. I think you will enjoy their remarks, and we'll then open it up for lots of audience participation then. We're first going to start out with, immediately to my left here, Tim Adams. Tim is currently the managing director of the Institute of International Finance. He also has been a partner at the Lindsay Group, but before that he had 6 to 7 years of government service in the Bush administration. He was the Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, very much an Asia hand, multiple times in Asia, particularly working on the currency issues of that time period. And has, I think, a very insightful knowledge. You can read the rest of his bio and Bob Hormetz's bio in the booklet, but I think Tim will provide us a terrific perspective and particularly a little bit of the Republican flavor from the Washington political framework. A little bit. Separately, Bob Hormetz is recently out of the Obama administration as the Undersecretary of State for Economic and Commercial Affairs. He is currently now with Kissinger and Associates, providing advice on international affairs matters, and he had a long career before that with Goldman Sachs, and also as a veteran of both Republican and Democratic administrations. And I think both of our guests, I think, again, have tremendous inside experience, knowledge of the Washington environment, and I think we will benefit greatly from their remarks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to each of them to speak for 5 minutes or so in terms of what their view is of the U.S. situation right now, and then we'll get started with some questions and then open it up. So Tim,
great,
why don't you get us started?
It's great to be back in Hong Kong and be at Credit Suisse, and good to be on the stage with two good friends. Bob Hormetz certainly has had a distinguished career in both the public and private sector. Joe and I get together for coffee regularly and solve all the world's problems.
Amen.
The topic today is, we haven't done a very good job, actually. The topic today is about
have consequences.
a U.S. economic and outlook, and what does that mean? What does it portend? And I heard Jim Bullard in the previous panel give a fairly optimistic assessment of the current economic conditions, and his outlook was pretty positive. And look, there's some great reasons to be excited. Rising asset prices, less fiscal drag, household balance sheets improved dramatically, shale oil, gas boom, corporate balance sheets are in good shape, record corporate profits. The financial system is healthier, stronger, more durable than any time in recent memory. Unemployment continues to fall. Payrolls at 177,000 per month over the last 6 months. Europe is stabilized. And we saw the consumer confidence numbers out this morning, which were pretty good. But I would say that really is a misleading patina on what is underneath those statistics, a much more harrowing set of conditions. And I would remind people that every forecast, every optimistic forecast for the past 5 years, including the Fed and the Congressional Budget Office and most official forecasters, have been incorrect. They've been overly optimistic, and we find that there's a forecast that says things will improve 3 or 4% growth, and in fact we end up with 1.5 or 2.5% growth. So let me just run through a couple of things that I find a bit troubling, and then the politics of those items. Housing's still soft. We saw just the numbers out today that new home sales fell to a 5-month low, down 3%. Existing home sales down 5%, lowest point in 1.5 years. Very little inventory. First-time home buyers are now 26% of the market. They were almost half the market pre-crisis. Why is it important? Because we haven't had a single recovery in the post-war era that wasn't led by housing. Housing has improved. Housing prices up. The Case-Shiller Index shows it. Prices are up. But it is still not leading this recovery. In addition to housing, wages are flat. Real wages for the past decade are flat, and for the bottom 70% of wage earners, they've actually fallen. You can't consume if you can't earn. Median household income in 2013 was below 1989. For the average household, they are worse off now than they were in 1989. Labor share of income is at the lowest point in 70 years. And in fact, we've seen labor share of income plummet over the past decade, despite the fact that previous to the crisis, productivity actually, over the previous 10 years, productivity increased by 25%. Inequality, we hear a lot about that in the politics of the U.S., and you hear more about it in the midterm election, the presidential elections. The top 1% consume 20% of pre-tax income. That's the highest since the 1920s. The top 10% control 2/3 of net worth, the highest since the 1920s. Labor force participation is now at a 35-year low. We were discussing that before we just came out, and I know Bob has some thoughts on it. And it's not just those retiring, and I heard President Bullard mention in the panel before, well, this is a demographic. Yes, there are some demographic drivers here. There's some non-demographic factors as well. Half the drop in labor force participation rate has nothing to do with retirees. It's mainly men between the ages of 25 and 35 and 45 and 55. These are individuals that are not going to rejoin the labor force, certainly not anytime soon. Long-term unemployment is still 3 times higher than it was pre-crisis. And 20-somethings have had a really tough time. We refer to them as the baby boom or the boomerang generation. 40% of recent college graduates are underemployed. 36% of 18 to 31-year-olds are living at home. It's the highest level since the 1950s. So they go out, they go to college, they can't get jobs, they come home, they live in the basement, and they bartend at the local restaurant. That means that you don't get household formation, you don't get marriages, you don't get acquisition or purchase of homes or cars or other durable goods. And the long-term fiscal situation of the U.S. is still fairly harrowing. The deficit is falling and falling radically. We'll probably hit 2.5% as a percentage of GDP next year, and we'll huddle there for a year or two, depending on growth. But once you get past 2017, it begins to explode again because of demographics, because of the retiring baby boom generation, and because of healthcare costs. 11,000 baby boomers retire every single year. They expect to get the benefits that they've been promised, even though it remains unseen how we're going to afford those benefits. Entitlement spending in the U.S. is now 60% of the budget, 60%. You add on net interest expense, and before you know it, you're at almost 70%, which is just on automatic pilot. Domestic discretionary spending, which are the things like highways and roads and border patrol and air traffic control systems, are now only 15% of the budget, and over time will be cannibalized by the transfer payment system from one generation to the next. So what does this mean for politics? Well, it's a pretty nasty mood in the United States, and I would refer to it as the politics of middle-class angst. It has been driving the political dialogue over the last couple of years, and I think that will become even more accentuated as we go into the midterm elections in November and then into the presidential elections in 2016. And I'll just run through some interesting statistics. 60% believe the nation is heading in the wrong direction. 50% of adults believe that their children will be worse off standard of living than they had. 68% say the economy is either stagnant or worse off since 2008. 60% say the nation is heading in the wrong direction. 70% say they're dissatisfied with the economy. 57% say the economy is still in recession. The president's approval rating is at 41%, which is historically low. And not to sound partisan, let me take on Congress and the Republican Party because they're not much better shape. 81% of the American people disapprove of Congress, and by a 2-to-1 margin, Americans believe they have a negative view of the Republican Party, and 2/3 of Americans say the Republican Party is out of touch. But interestingly, the American people give the Republican Party, which they see as out of touch, higher marks on taxes, the economy, and deficit and spending. A bit of an ironic outcome. Americans are unhappy, and they're unhappy with their current but expected economic future. And that will shape the way in which politicians try to legislate, try to manage over the next few months, but the way in which each party will develop their narrative over the next 8 months and over the next 2.5 years. It is the narrative of who's going to stand up for the middle class. Now, why should you care in Hong Kong? Because I think there's a rising sense of isolationism, of anti-free trade. Interestingly, the president, which I applaud for negotiating the TPP, here in Asia, also transatlantic trade negotiations, is working to try to get trade promotion authority. So the Senate is then disallowed from being able to amend various trade bills. All these things the president, I think, is trying to show leadership on. 48 hours after the State of the Union address, in which he supported those policies, the majority leader of the Senate came out and opposed them. So the politics, and it's not just for Democrats, it's Republicans as well. It's a party, it is a movement of isolationism, of anti-free trade, of the U.S. first. And that will color the debate from both the left and the right over the next 8 months and certainly the next 2.5 years. With that, I'll turn it over.
Bob?
Well, thanks very much. I think Tim has made a number of very important points, and let me just try to give you some thoughts about some of the more positive elements, although I would also stipulate that the kinds of concerns that he has very effectively articulated are weighing on the economy and preventing what appears to be a recovery from being a robust recovery, and very importantly, a recovery that the average American sees as benefiting them. And I think this is where we both agree very much and where the problems down the road are going to occur. There has been a substantial deleveraging of a very highly leveraged economy that existed in 2007, 2008, where you have bank balance sheets in much better shape. Households have deleveraged quite substantially. The average corporation now has a pretty firm balance sheet with a fair amount of cash, some of which is used for buying back shares, others for increasing dividends, in some cases for making new investments. The housing market has its difficulties, Tim has pointed out quite well. It's better than it was, but when you get such a deep hole as we had in 2007, 2008, it's very hard to pull out of that, and certainly very hard to pull out of that very quickly. The innovation part of the American economy remains quite robust, and we still have this remarkable innovation machine, not just in Silicon Valley, but other parts of the country as well. The capacity of the American economy to be innovative is very powerful. And then we have a very substantial improvement in the energy sector. I don't want to exaggerate it because energy can't cure all ills, and as we've seen, a lot of countries that have a lot of energy have deficiencies in other areas, but the American energy sector is doing well. Gas, fracking, horizontal drilling, tight oil, all these things have been responsible for creating large numbers of jobs, not just in the drilling sector and the exploration sector, but in the build out of the infrastructure required to move the oil and gas from where it is produced to where it is used. And that has reduced our dependence on imported oil. It used to be 60%, now it's 40%. We have reduced dramatically our dependence on natural gas, much of which came from Qatar and other countries in the Middle East. We depend very little on that now, which has enabled more of that to go to Europe and to Asia, which has freed up and created more competition in global energy markets. So all these things, I think, are positives and have made the economy look better. And then you've got the stock market, which has done remarkably well, which is both, in the eyes of some, a leading indicator, but certainly increases the wealth of those who own shares. So these are some very positive things. The problem is that for the average American, it doesn't feel like a really strong recovery. And the reasons that Tim described are exactly the reasons why this is the case. If you look at productivity normally in the American economy, where you see improvements in productivity, they get divided up between the profits of the companies that enjoy that higher or produce that higher rate of productivity and the workers who help engage in that productivity. The fact is, as Tim has indicated, wages as a share of GDP have really been very disappointing. A lot of the benefits of that productivity and of growth have gone to those who hold capital rather than the workers who work in the factories and other parts of the economy. So they feel, and if you look at their numbers, it's not an incorrect feeling, that the fruits of the improvement in the economy, the fruits of the improvement in productivity, have gone to those who hold capital and sort of upper income people to advance their incomes, whereas the average middle income person, not just workers, but people who own shops and small businesses, don't feel that they have benefited very much at all. And when you look at the populist movements in the United States, they're not from low-income people. They're from middle-income people. And if they look at the Tea Party is not a movement of low-income individuals. It's middle-income people who feel that, for a variety of reasons, the system is sort of stacked against them. The government's borrowing a lot of money, raising taxes, and they are going to have to pay the bill either now with higher taxes or down the road when all these contingent liabilities that Tim's talked about have to be paid. Or if they don't have to pay it, their kids pay it. The other part of it is the way the bailouts, the TARP and the stimulus program were put together. Large financial institutions were provided with assistance that was in fact needed, and if they'd not gotten that assistance, not only would they have been hurt, but the overall economy and the overall financial system would have deteriorated. One can debate how much was needed, but I think there's a general view that the government taking a very proactive approach was a necessary thing to do. One can quibble with the details, but the general notion was it was needed. The fact, however, is that for the average person, they perceive that financial institutions have now been put back on their feet. They're doing well, bonuses are there. But for the average small and medium-sized company, it is very hard to get capital. So whereas big companies seem able to get capital, financial institutions have access to capital, if you're running a small enterprise in Des Moines, Iowa, you're finding it very difficult to get capital. So they say, who benefited? Did I benefit from this? Well, to a degree they did in sort of a second order benefit, but they don't perceive that they did, and they don't perceive that it's easier for them to get capital now. In fact, in some cases, they would perceive it to be more difficult to get capital. So this is leading to a feeling that middle-class Americans are, because of the wage factor and because of the inability to get capital, are not included, don't feel included in the recovery of the American economy. And there are lots of implications. Tim's talked about a few of them, and let me just add a couple more because I think it does relate to America's role in Asia. And that is the question, there was a big high level of attention given a couple of years ago to the fact that the United States was pivoting toward Asia. And I wasn't particularly crazy about the term to begin with, but the United States was certainly paying more attention to Asia. The argument was, well, the United States was shifting away from the Middle East, now paying more attention to Asia. The difficulty that people have now is figuring out, as a result of what's going on in the Middle East and now what's going on in Ukraine, particularly Crimea, is the United States going to be able to continue to play a sustained and constructive role in the region? And if you look at the future of the American fiscal situation that Tim talked about, and you say to yourself, the government's contingent liabilities as a result of entitlement promises are rising, someone has to pay for them. So that's going to suck money out of somewhere. Either the budget, which means there's less money available for security or anything else, or taxes are going to go up. What it will mean is the average American is going to feel less and less inclined to support military activities, security activities around the world, or a more expansive foreign policy. There's going to be an attempt, people now say we should indulge in nation building at home and not abroad. Well, almost all the polls indicate, including a very recent Pew poll, indicate Americans really want to pull back. Why do they want to pull back? Because the resources that we do have, they want to be devoted to domestic things. So the ability of the United States to sustain a proactive role in this region, or indeed any other part of the world, is going to be more and more challenged by these budgetary constraints and by the feeling that Americans have that somehow globalization, internationalization, global trade agreements may benefit big companies and big financial institutions, but not them. If you took a vote on what has been probably the most successful trade agreement the United States has ever had, which is NAFTA, it wouldn't pass. Even the supporters of NAFTA would tell you that would not pass either house of the Congress today, and neither party would support it. There'd be a few members who would, but it almost certainly wouldn't pass. And this has been very successful, created a lot of jobs in the United States, a lot of jobs in Mexico, a lot of jobs in China, strengthens the North American region, but very unpopular because it's considered a threat to jobs. Now we have TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Tim's right, the majority leader, a Democrat, opposed it. After the president, in his State of the Union, the biggest speech of the year, endorsed it. So this raises questions around the world as to whether the United States does have the staying power to play an active, constructive role in the region. So I'll stop here. I think there are some positive things that are going on, but there are, as a result of structural difficulties in the United States, feelings among Americans that they're not, that in globalization, technological improvement, all these things that look good, the average person it doesn't feel included in the benefits. And if there are gaps in the society in the United States, and a feeling that somehow they're not benefiting from globalization or technology, there's a tendency to turn inward. And when you add that to the medium-term budget outlook, the capacity of the United States to play a constructive global role is going to be more and more constrained. And I think this is one of the difficulties. Profits may look good for a while because profits, a lot of the benefits of productivity and growth have gone into profits of American companies, but if you don't have sustained job creation, then over a period of time, the ability of companies to make profits and to sell their goods is going to be limited, and the willingness of Americans to invest when they see a sluggish labor market and they don't see a robust recovery in earning power and in jobs, that's going to be constrained as well.
No, thank you. Thank you all, both of you, for those remarks. I guess the question I sort of have maybe to kick us off, so you know, I think you both paint a picture of a challenging domestic economic environment in the U.S. with a recovery that may be mixed in its results so far. I guess from an Asian perspective, I would be curious, given that it sounds like both of you, in terms of the relative priorities, it almost says that Asia, greater economic engagement in Asia or other places has to wait really until that sort of house gets put back in order and the fiscal situation gets sorted out or headed on a more positive direction. If that is the case, and if you would agree with that, I guess my question is then, what do you both have great experience out here, what do you see as filling the gap? How will the pieces on the puzzle move during that vacuum? What will fill that vacuum?
Yeah, a great question. You know, I think the private sector, corporate America, is engaged in spite of Washington's incapacity to lead. I was just at the China Development Forum in Beijing, and you've got Caterpillar and Boeing and DuPont and, you know, all the major corporations, and they're here on the ground, and they're doing business, and, you know, they probably want Washington just to get out of the way. So I think businesses have always been a leader, and the issue is, can Washington can we have political leadership with respect to the region? And I think it's going to be very constrained for the reasons Bob just cited and I cited myself. The president's going to be very focused on domestic issues. Congress certainly focused on domestic issues. Just when you think you can play offense, the pivot to Asia or other places. It's amazing how foreign policy disruptions pop up out of nowhere. Who would have thought that we'd have riots in the street in Kiev and you'd have a change in leadership and the Russians would be occupying Crimea? No one thought that 6 months ago. Who knows what is the next event that no one's thinking about on the foreign policy stage, which is going to occupy the president's time and attention. The president rarely has the capacity to play offense. You're always playing defense, especially on foreign policy. So I think the president's sincere in wanting to engage in the region. We certainly applaud that. I just think that the idea that you can move your attention away from the Middle East or from particular areas of the world to something else is wonderful in the sterile environment of academia, but it rarely is the case with respect to how the real world develops.
Yeah. There's a wonderful quote by former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Great Britain, and things were going quite well early in his tenure, and someone in the press asked him, well, Prime Minister, what could disrupt this very positive period of support that you're getting and the fact that Britain seems to be on the right track? So Macmillan says, events, my dear boy, events. And I think that this is one of the things that occurs when you're trying to assume a positive view and pursue your own agenda. There's always something that you don't anticipate that is going to interfere with this. And certainly Ukraine has been something, as Tim says, no one anticipated. I do think that on the trade side, which I regard as very important because we have a network of trade relations in various parts of the world, but we don't really have one across the Pacific. There's APEC and there are things like that, but we really, apart from the US-Korean free trade agreement, there's not, and a couple of other free trade agreements, New Zealand, Australia, and a few others, but nothing comprehensive. I think this would be extremely positive and would show not just that the United States and the countries of the Pacific, or several countries, are engaged in open trade, but it would be a strong political signal of sustained engagement. And I think that the president needs to, as with Europe, and maybe this is a good opportunity with Europe, Ukraine, to demonstrate that this is not just some international thing between us and them, it is part of the future growth and productivity of the American economy to engage in agreements where there are common understandings about regulations, about standard setting, about labor market, quality of labor markets, environmental quality, cooperation, things of this nature. So I think it would be very important, but it has to be portrayed not just as something that trade negotiators do, but as part of a strategy for a more dynamic American economy and part of a strategy of a more dynamic Pacific economy, which benefits both sides of countries on both sides of the Pacific. So I think this is certainly one thing. And you know, what's clear about the Ukraine issue is that this is being watched very closely in this part of the world. You know, for one country to, in effect, march in and take over a part of another country, and if that stands, it creates signals in other parts of the world that this kind of action, while not good and certainly harmful, is something that countries can get away with. So it emboldens people to think that they can do similar things or push their influence out without effective resistance. I don't mean military resistance, I mean the global system coming together and saying this is not permissible behavior and you shouldn't do it. This is a big test. You know, Crimea may look very small, but symbolically it is very significant. And therefore it's not just some isolated event that will cause difficulties. It's a signal, and how it's dealt with by the international community is going to be a signal of whether this kind of thing can stand or whether there's enough resistance to reverse it. And if there's not enough resistance to reverse it, then does that give other countries ideas they can do not so much the same thing, but similar things of pushing out their influence, and that would create a lot of issues, not just in this part of the world, but other parts of the world also.
Changing tacks a little bit, I was curious what your respective views are on the Washington view of China and the economy in China. Several years ago when we were out at this conference, we had a lot of discussion of China as a currency manipulator, et cetera. We've kind of moved past that at this point, but I'm curious whether there are other concerns in Washington now about the debt situation, other aspects of the Chinese economy or the currency situations that remains that you all may think is a particular concern or a particular focal point now in Washington.
You know, it's interesting. When I was at the Treasury Department, I had to prepare the currency report, and it was always about, are you going to name China or you're not going to name them? It was an awful process, and we never did for a whole host of reasons. I think the temperature's been turned down significantly in Washington with respect to China and those kinds of issues. I think there is interest in the protection of intellectual property rights. You certainly hear that. Market access. There's currently negotiations going on for a bilateral investment treaty, which would make a big difference with respect to more investment going in and how it's protected and treated on an equal footing in China. I think that's very important. Mike Froman, the U.S. Trade Representative in the White House, is very adamant about finishing those negotiations. But I think there's less concern, and certainly the politics, despite what I said earlier about the middle-class angst, there's less concern about China as the villain in the global economy. Now, that may come back. We saw in the last election cycle a number of very sinister-looking commercials being run that basically showed the Chinese, dominating the world, and therefore you need to vote for the person who's going to stop it. But we see less of that now. I think where I hear the angst is in New York and London. It's really about the financial markets. In fact, I think there's a mathematical equation. The farther you get away from Beijing, the worse the perception is about the economic conditions. And certainly the economy has slowed, and certainly there's overcapacity, and there's a tremendous amount of credit being created and misallocated. What worries me most about China is if you look at the marginal efficiency of capital, the return on investment, if you will, it's been falling dramatically. So the growth has been going like this, but you're getting less and less for the amount of credit you're putting in. And that's not sustainable. But the Chinese leadership knows this. I was just at the China Development Forum, as I mentioned. Their plan, their blueprint for the future is spot on. It's not about what to do. It's about the capacity to actually do it. And there's a number of constraints. But it's about a better allocation of capital away from smokestack industries, the state-owned enterprises, all the things that we know, real estate, the steel industry, and to services, consumption, small, medium-sized enterprises, green technology. I think there's a consensus. It's not about what to do. It's about the ability to implement it. And I think given where Washington is, they're incredibly supportive. They want this Chinese government, this new government, to succeed.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think it's, in the last 4 years when I was in the State Department, we had these strategic and economic dialogues with China every year. And I think they became progressively more and more effective, and they revealed something that Tim put his finger on very well, and that is that the United States has every reason to want China to be a strong, rapidly growing economy that overcomes some of these credit issues that it faces, that overcomes these environmental issues, where there's a greater degree of dispersion of purchasing power, where there's less dependence on exports and more on domestic consumption, where there is less reliance on exports and more reliance on domestic demand. If you look at the various components of the 12th five-year plan, a very large number of them, of the goals that China has set for itself, are also very constructive in improving the balance between China in economic and financial and trade relations, and strengthening economic ties and commercial ties between the two countries. There are very few elements that in that plan that are antithetical to the interests of the United States. There are a couple of issues that Tim has touched on that I do think remain troublesome. The protection of intellectual property, protection of trade secrets, sometimes the arbitrariness of certain decisions, or at least some of the opaque decision-making procedures that go on in China. But I think China itself is improving the treatment of intellectual property. I think China, as Chinese develop their own intellectual property, they want it protected as well. Trade secrets, Chinese companies are developing more and more of their own copyrights and other devices for protecting trade secrets. They want them protected as well. So while the process has not moved as rapidly as the United States would like, it is moving in the right direction. And I do think that if you're sitting in Washington, you may have individual issues, and we always did. We had lots of issues that came up between the US and China, and we had the economic channel that I sat in was headed by Wang Qishan on the Chinese side, and the Secretary of the Treasury was Geithner at the time, and then and Jack Lew after that. There were a lot of very candid conversations on the economic side, but most of them were designed to figure out where the United States and China could work together. It's not that there was always agreement. There was not. There were issues that were very hotly debated, but there was also an understanding that both sides would be served if you could either reach agreement or manage differences in an orderly, constructive way. This is not to say that either side was naive and either side thought these issues could be resolved all at once. Everyone agreed that was not likely, but that they needed to be managed in such a way that we didn't have battles over the currency, that we didn't have battles over trade secrets or cyber issues. They're all issues, but the question is not whether they evaporate. They won't evaporate, but how well and how effectively they can be managed, because it's increasingly clear that if you're going to manage the global economy in a constructive way, you can't do it without the United States and China working together. And that sounds simple and naive, but from the positions that both of us have held, I think we both agree that that was essential. Not that we're going to achieve perfection, and certainly not achieve it quickly, but that we are on the right track in at least managing the issues where we can't agree.
Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Peter Kwong, Harvard Group. I'd like to ask panel on Ukraine. Obviously, as we know, that the Ukraine being the sort of the wheat basket for Russia for many years, and also 7 out of 11 natural gas pipelines goes through from Russia, go through Ukraine to serving the EU. My question is beyond Crimea. I'd like to ask Tim in particular, being the Undersecretary of International Affairs, what is your calculation in terms of, should Russia go beyond Crimea to, obviously march forces, military forces beyond that, thereby destabilizing the entire EU and in the commerce and economy. What kind of negative impact do you think that may lead to, based on your experience in office in Washington, and what kind of ultimate effect economically, globally, for that matter? Thanks.
It's a great question. My baseline assumption is that you have a steady state equilibrium where we are, and with that, Ukraine goes through a painful adjustment program. The IMF was just out there. They'll probably see the economy shrink by somewhere between 7 to 10% this year, which is enormous. That's more than Greece. You probably may see a recession in Russia. So that's with everything at its current equilibrium. So a very tough set of conditions in both Ukraine, but it's isolated. You don't have much spillover effect really to Eastern Europe. And the Russians need to sell gas and oil and continue pumping. If, however, as you've described, maybe forays into Eastern Ukraine, then I think all bets are off. I think you see a really ratcheting up of sanctions on behalf of the US and Europe, which really begins to target a wide group of individuals, firms, and banks. The Russians are incredibly dependent on importation of capital and selling oil and gas. I think then the Eastern European countries become impacted, and even Western European. If you look at Germany, they sell autos, industrial equipment, and chemicals, and there's enormous exposure of Western European banks to Russia. So if we stay where we are, I think it can be managed diplomatically. Whether Ukraine can function over the next couple of years remains to be seen. They will get some support from the IMF, from the US and Europe, although their history with IMF programs is not a positive one, and maybe Russia limps along. But if the Russians decide to move into eastern Ukraine, then I think, as I like to say, the world is nonlinear, and that's a nonlinear event, and we'll have a whole host of implications which will have us to rethink our current market expectations.
Yeah, and I think the IMF point is a very good one. Here's the difficulty in Ukraine, and that is, Tim's put it very well, that they haven't had a good set of experiences with the IMF ever.
Ever.
So here's what the IMF will want, among other things. Good financial management has not been a hallmark of Ukraine governance for a long time, to have good financial management. Very specifically, a reduction of energy subsidies. That is hardly popular in an environment where the government is running for office in these elections in May to say, part of our platform is we're going to reduce your energy subsidy. That is not a vote-winning strategy. On the other hand, it's the only way the IMF is going to give them any money. It's the only way they're going to reduce their dependence on imported capital. It's a similar situation to Egypt several months ago. So this is going to be a very difficult problem for the Ukrainians to come to grips with, because it's very hard to see the US or Europe giving them a lot of money unless they pardon me, do things that improve their own economy, and that is going to be very unpopular politically. With respect to Russia, Tim's absolutely right. They don't really have a capital market to speak of. They have a bank market. A lot of funding comes from the banks, but the banks fund themselves in London and elsewhere, including the big banks. Not some of them, Sberbank has domestic sources of capital, but a lot of the others don't. So they're going to have to get money in the London market, and a lot of their companies borrow in the international market. So they've got this rollover. And the sanctions themselves, it's quite interesting, they're really not, in terms of order of magnitude, very large. They're against a few oligarchs. Not a lot of money is affected directly by the sanctions, but the investment environment is affected very dramatically by the sanctions, and very dramatically by the expectation of more sanctions. So, for instance, the credit card companies, MasterCard and Visa, have pulled back. That wasn't because of sanctions. That was because they decided this is a troublesome thing. They didn't want to do it. And I think a lot of companies are going to come to the conclusion. American companies that had money in Russia to invest are pulling it out of Russia. And the ruble is convertible. So it's one for one. You can exchange dollars for rubles or euros for rubles anywhere. If you want to get your money out of Russia, you can do it tomorrow, and large volumes of it. Then the question is, do the Russians impose capital controls? That would have very severe consequences. Could it come to that? I don't know. But if they get enough money going out of Russia, there'll be pressure to do that. I'm not sure they will, but there are a lot of second and third order implications of this that are very hard to predict. And as Tim said, if things get worse, then other things are going to kick in, and it's hard to predict what they'll be. But it's easy to predict that whatever they are, they'll weaken an economy that was already growing at only 1%. This is the Russian economy, and you don't need much to tip a 1% growth economy into a negative growth economy. We've seen that in other countries.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your time. This morning, the chairman of China's Sovereign Wealth Fund, Chairman Li, he raised several points. A few of them touch upon the investment environment beyond China's borders, given that its mandate is to invest overseas. He made a comment this morning saying that he would wish, among other things, to see a more open and transparent global environment to invest in. And he actually listed several examples, including what he feels to be the so-called double standards by certain countries. And he also specifically mentioned that U.S. infrastructure, among other fields, is an interesting field that he would like to get more involved in. What are your thoughts on this, especially given what you've previously mentioned, namely the increasing isolationism or the kind of increased angst among ordinary Americans with this issue? Thanks.
Well, the U.S. certainly needs infrastructure investment, and we should take it wherever we can get it, but it is politically sensitive. I was at the U.S. Treasury Department during the whole Dubai ports debacle, in which there was going to be a sale from a non-U.S. company to a non-U.S. company with respect to the ports at Long Beach. And there was an enormous political outcry, even though over security, even though security was provided by the U.S. Coast Guard and other U.S. institutions. So it goes to the point I made earlier that there is this concern and sensitivity towards foreign investment, certainly from certain parts of the world. And the Chinese have complained bitterly about the CFIUS process, which evaluates foreign investment in the U.S., and there have been some celebrated cases which they've been unhappy with. I would argue that it's very difficult for U.S. firms to invest in China and at a level playing field as well, but we'll put those disputes behind us. It's not my job anymore. But we should be open to Chinese investment. I know they're very interested in doing rail and highways and a host of things, and we should look for opportunities to import capital. We need investment and we need infrastructure in the United States, and we ought to take it wherever we can get it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, I mean, there is the CFIUS process. It is clear in the law what CFIUS is supposed to do, but the internal workings of CFIUS are not open. They're based on deliberations that are not publicized. It's not like the Federal Reserve where there are notes that are published every so often. And it is difficult for some countries to understand how it works and what criteria are utilized. I and Tim, both of us sat in on these CFIUS meetings, and I think I would certainly say that they are deliberative, and there's every attempt made to be fair and to come up with balanced solutions. But it is hard. I accept that it's hard for China and other countries to understand the process because it is kept within the four walls of the room where the deliberations take place. But I would say that if you look at the results in terms of investment in the United States, China has now been able to invest in a number of very important sectors of the American economy, including one of the most strategically important, which is shale. There's very substantial Chinese investment in American shale. Energy investments were 10 years ago would have caused lots of political concern. Now this investment in shale took place without almost any political pushback. In the media, a large Chinese company, Wanda, owns AMC, the biggest theater chain in the United States. So there are a lot of areas where Chinese investment has taken place without any political reaction or any resistance at all. And I would argue that we in the United States have to get used to the fact that as a capital importing country, as Tim has underscored, we should be importing capital that creates jobs and opportunities for Americans, and China is going to be, through the going out policy, a more and more active investor, and we just have to figure out a set of procedures for active cooperation to ensure that that investment is provided in ways that don't cause political reactions. And I think for the most part, that is not only doable, but has in fact been done, and I think will continue. So this is a process that's well underway, and I think that if we do have a bilateral investment treaty, and I think there is a real chance that we can negotiate a bilateral investment treaty within the next year or so, or 2 years, that would be enormously helpful to support China's going out policy, and also support American companies having the kind of pre-establishment treatment that they want, national treatment that they would like in China, and also a negative list, which would determine companies that can't invest or sectors in which investment can't take place, but also would say that those sectors that are not, or those types of businesses that are not on the negative list can come in without a lot of red tape. So I think if you look at the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, there are a number of provisions in that are experimental and new, but if they're incorporated in the bilateral investment treaty, could improve opportunities for American companies in China, and China would have a clear idea of what kinds of investments it could make in the United States and would reduce political pushback. And also the last point I make is a lot of what's going to happen in the investment sector depends on cooperation between mayors and governors in China, or provincial party secretaries, and the mayors and governors in the United States, because a lot of it is done at the local level with, if you get governors supporting it, then it helps to improve the environment for the investment and the political acceptability of it.
I think we're near the end of the time of our session now, and I think both Bob and Tim are going to be around the conference, I think, for the rest of the day. So hopefully for additional questions, please, and I'm putting them on the spot here, but please feel free to pull them aside, and I'm sure they'll be happy with their time. I will just ask one last question for a one-name answer. I will ask Bob. It's unusual for us to have one of these sessions without any election talk, so I will ask Bob, as a Democrat, if Hillary Clinton is not the nominee in 2016, who you would think it would be. And for Tim, who will the Republican nominee be?
Boy, that's a... I'll let you go first.
I worked for Hillary for 4 years. Hypothetical questions are probably best avoided, but I would say that I think there is an enormously high probability that Hillary Clinton will be the Democratic nominee, and there is an equally high probability that if in fact she is the Democratic nominee, she'll be elected president. And I think
Not sure that was the question. Not sure that was the question at all. Tim?
I've got a couple of good friends who are going to be running from the GOP, so I'm going to make someone unhappy with this prediction. You and I had this discussion. I think Rand Paul, and I think it because he's going to energize a youthful movement that's going to be looking for a new set of politics and a new set of leaders, and they're going to want to move forward rather than moving back. So that's my forecast here today.
Okay, very good. Thank you all very much. You were terrific. And thank you everyone for joining us.